Welcome back to Voice of East Turkistan podcast. I'm your host Nadira. Today, we are discussing the relationship between Pakistan and China and its impact on East Turkestan. Joining us is Usman A, a Pakistani journalist with nearly a decade of experience in print and broadcast media. His interest and research into the Middle East and China have given him a unique outlook, allowing him to write cogently on a myriad of topics. Welcome to the show, Usman.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be on your show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your coming. So let's start for our discussion today. And my first question is, could you just explain for us China and Pakistan relations and what factors influence these strategic relationships? Thank you.
Yes, of course, that's a very important question for anyone to understand the dynamics between Pakistan and China. But before we start exploring that, it's very important for me to mention that we have to understand where Pakistan is located. So when you see Pakistan on the map, on one side you have India, which is a hostile neighbor. Pakistan has fought wars with India for Kashmir, 1965, 1971. And when both countries got independence in 1947, they fought a war just a year later in 1948. And on the western front of Pakistan, you have Afghanistan, and we all know the US invasion, and before that, the Soviet invasion, and now the Taliban is in Afghanistan. So you have these two countries. And then on the other side, you have China. So for Pakistan, it's very important to have good relations with China within this particular neighborhood, because if Pakistan were to abandon China or not have good relations with it, then Pakistan would be surrounded with hostile neighbors. And of course, I forgot to mention that Iran is another neighbor of Pakistan, and their relations have always been we can say topsy-turvy. Like they're not bad, but they're not good either. Like, they're not like close friends.
Yes.
So this is why Pakistan has always been good friends with China since its independence. And China and Pakistan, they started this friendship. In my country, this Arc-China friendship is talked about by the politicians, by the people in the army, by journalists. Like even in schools and in universities, we're taught that China, in Urdu, we call China Chin, that this country has always been a good friend for Pakistan. So, and because of this reason, Pakistan has always maintained good relations with China, and China has done the same. They both do trade. China invests in Pakistan in terms of infrastructure, like this project called China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. I'm sure we're going to discuss that in a bit more detail later. But China helps Pakistan in lots of different things. And even supports Pakistan diplomatically at the United Nations as well. So these two countries have always had really good relations since Pakistan's creation. Like these both countries, they've had really good relations.
Thank you so much. Thank you for breaking that down. And now let's dive into specific aspects of this partnership. So, how could or might China's projects in Pakistan, such as CPEC, the Economic Corridor, affect regional stability and economic development in the short and long term?
Yes, that's another very vital question. Another aspect that I must highlight before I begin talking about CPEC. In our part of the world, we don't call it CPEC, we call it CPEC. So from here on, for your audience, I'm going to mention it as CPEC. So when I mention it, it means obviously CPEC.
Yes.
When I was talking about Pakistan's allies, another ally of Pakistan has always been the United States. Because when the United States invaded Afghanistan, Pakistan provided the corridor for NATO to go through Pakistan and into Afghanistan and supply routes, and Pakistan in return was supported by the US. So back in that time, Pakistan's relations with the U.S. were really strong. But ever since the U.S. moved out of Afghanistan, Pakistan has been relying more and more on China. So, but within the Pakistani think tankers and diplomacy makers and foreign policy makers, they always have to maintain a very tight rope between balancing their relations between the US on one side and China on the other side. So they have to like balance it out, because sometimes they try to move towards the US and China doesn't like it, but then they try to move towards China and then the US doesn't like it. So
Yes.
Pakistani diplomacy people and the foreign policy makers, they have to maintain a very delicate balance. So with that out of the way, now we can start talking a little bit about CPEC. So this project is part of, obviously we know, China's One Belt, One Road initiative, which China has been financing in different parts of the world, Asia as well, in Africa. So China came up with this idea that it will start its project from East Turkistan, which in Pakistan everyone calls it as Xinjiang, but obviously I know that Uyghur people, they don't like to call it Xinjiang, obviously because it's a colonized country of theirs. So from Kashgar in East Turkestan all the way to Gawadar in Pakistan's Balochistan, China and Pakistan, they came up with this idea that they will have this corridor which will give jobs to people. China will help build a really nice and a warm water port, the Gawadar port, which in future would become really important for Pakistan. But the problem that most people don't understand when it comes to CPEC is that both the Balochistan region of Pakistan and the Xinjiang or East Turkestan region of China, they both have problems, and they both the regions have people who are persecuted and marginalized. In Balochistan, you have the Balochi people. They're not happy with how their area has been used by Pakistan and China to exploit for minerals, for the natural gas, for gold, coal, and different resources from that Balochistan region. And what's sad is that within Balochistan's interior parts, there's not a lot of infrastructure, there's not a lot of quality education, even roads and hospitals are not there. So the Baloch people, they have to either go to Quetta, which is the capital of the Balochistan region, from smaller cities, or they have to go to Islamabad, which is the capital of the country itself, or they have to go to Lahore, where I'm based, which is the capital of the Punjab province. So they have to like really travel far for basic needs. And the Baloch students as well, they have to leave their small areas and they have to go to bigger cities for quality education. They go to Karachi or Islamabad or Lahore. So like within their own province, there's not a lot of infrastructure that is developed. And when you go back to the start of CPEC, where it starts from in Kashgar, we all know what's been happening in East Turkestan for the past decade and more. There's the concentration camps, which China calls re-education camps. There's this ongoing Uyghur genocide, and I've personally I haven't seen the interior part of East Turkestan, but I've been to Urumqi a few years ago, and I've noticed how things are at the Urumqi airport. And when I used to look at the Uyghur people, they always seemed scared and very nervous whenever I saw them walking or just moving around. And I also noticed that all the security at the airport and all the important jobs are taken by Han people, and Uyghurs, they don't really have as many government jobs in their own region, which is quite sad. So both of these regions are marginalized, and both of these regions need better livelihoods for their own people, but that hasn't really been the case. And So for East Turkestan, CPEC is supposed to bring a lot of investments. It's supposed to bring jobs. I mean, that's what China says, right? And even for the Baloch people in Pakistan, the government says that it's going to improve their life. But the CPEC project has started for more than 10, 15 plus years, but we don't really see much happening on the ground. So I like to call this project a white elephant because it hasn't really delivered for Pakistani people as much. And obviously, it hasn't really delivered for the Uyghur people also, because how will it deliver for them when they are being put in concentration camps, which is a sad reality. So this is how I would sum it up.
Thank you. That is a really interesting, like insightful perspective. Thank you so much. And let's move to the next question. And how does Pakistan see the importance of East Turkestan, and how do the Pakistani people see East Turkestan?
This is another vital question. Bigger person to understand, like Pakistan is one of the biggest Muslim countries in the world, right?
Yes.
And Pakistan likes to talk about Palestine. Pakistan likes to talk about Syria. Pakistan likes to talk about Kashmir. Pakistan always tries to talk about the important Muslim issues all across the world. And in the 90s, Pakistan was also talking about Bosnia, and it was also helping the Bosniak people. But it's a very sad reality that I must share with your listeners, that when it comes to East Turkestan and when it comes to the suffering and the egregious oppression that the Uyghur people have been facing for the past 50, 60 plus years, Pakistani people are very unaware. And it's very sad that they honestly learn about the Uyghur struggle. They don't take their time to know about their pain, their suffering. And when we start, like some of journalists like me in Pakistan are, I mean, it's strange for me to talk about my own self, but I have yet to find anyone who talks about Uyghur people while being in Pakistan. And when I try to talk to them about, like, my fellow journalists and intellectuals, teachers, and people in the media, when I try to bring this topic, they're always very shy to discuss it, because they're like, we don't want to make our ally China angry, because if we start talking about this issue, China would get angry, and China is our only ally. So we should not talk about Uyghurs. But when I look at that, I find it quite pathetic and disgusting, because you are looking at an entire group of people from a very transactional point of view, that you're looking at Uyghur people from the prism of your relations with China, which is quite unfortunate, because sure, China is an ally, but at the same time, China is also committing a genocide. So two things can be right at the same time: the suffering of the people and your relations with China. If you're a strong country, at least you can talk to China that, what you're doing in East Turkestan is inhumane. It's barbaric. Do something about it. But the sad reality is that most Pakistani people, they don't even bother. Some of them, they don't even know that what's happening in Xinjiang. Some of them, when they get to hear about the suffering or the genocide in Xinjiang, or the slave labor, or the forced sterilization of Uyghur women, or the fact that Uyghur children are ripped apart from Uyghur families, and then they're taught in these kindergartens where they're brainwashed, and they're taught Xi Jinping's ridiculous ideologies, and basically they're brainwashed into becoming Han Chinese. Their culture, their identity, their religion, China wants to remove and eradicate everything, so that they become all like Han people, like China wants to assimilate. So when you tell this to some Pakistanis, they call it propaganda. They call it Western propaganda. And of course, China uses some propagandists, some foreigners, some podcasters, and China invites them into Xinjiang, into East Turkestan, and they can go and see places that normal journalists cannot, right?
Yes.
And China then uses these propagandas to paint this picture that, look, nothing is happening in East Turkistan. Everything is fine. Uyghur people are happy. Or sometimes they use this very common propaganda talking point that China lifted people from poverty, and Uyghur people, their population is only increasing, it's not decreasing. So it's the same propaganda talking points that the CCP or the Xinhua news agency, they share it with these foreigners who are propagandists, and then these foreigners, they spread it around in their circles, and then Pakistanis follow some of these idiot individuals, and then when you talk to them about the suffering of the Uyghur people, they say it's all Western propaganda. And but then when I tell them that Israel says the same about what it's doing in Palestine, Israel calls it like tries to justify it that they're terrorists or they're this or that, but you don't fall for that propaganda. You actually side with the Palestinian people. But why is it that when it comes to the Uyghur people, you want to side with an authoritarian government, CCP, and you want to believe whatever nonsense the CCP tells you? It's quite unfortunate. And there are some Pakistani socialists, I'm not going to take their names, but some of them, they teach in universities, some of them, they have their own podcast, and they write on Facebook and Twitter, etc. So sometimes I debate with them, and they label everything that comes out of East Turkestan in terms of the Uyghur people suffering as Western propaganda. And they come up with this ridiculous idea that the Western governments, the US, NATO, and others, they want to weaken China, and they want to destabilize this region so that China would become weak. And but I counter that argument by saying that the US is not telling China to put Uyghur people in concentration camps or put them into slave labor or to make their lives miserable. The Xi Jinping government has been doing it on its own. The US didn't tell them to do it. The UK didn't tell them to do it. Canada didn't tell them to do it. So how is it Western propaganda? China is the one that is carrying out this genocide. The UN has confirmed it. Uyghur people, their testimonies have come out, whether you talk to them who are based in Canada or the UK or Netherlands. All you have to do is talk to Uyghur people in the diaspora, and then you'll find out these horrifying stories. Literally every Uyghur person that is based abroad has a family member or multiple family members who had disappeared in these concentration camps. But it's really unfortunate that Pakistani people, even though they're Muslims and they talk about Islam, but they have by and large abandoned Uyghur people, which is quite unfortunate. But I'm one of the very few journalists who keeps trying to educate the masses about this to the best of my abilities. And I have done some job that now people at least know a little bit, but there's still a lot of work to be done, I feel.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your effort and everything. And that brings us more closer to genocide in East Turkestan. And then, as we know, it is a topic that often overlooked in discussions about China and Pakistan relations. So my final question is going to be, did China's genocidal policies in East Turkestan affect its image in Pakistan? And what should or could Pakistan do about it? Thank you.
Yes, of course, that's a vital question, and it's important to unpack it and uncover it regarding China's image. Now, before I begin, I must compare how Israel carries out how it carried out its genocide in Gaza and some of the crimes it has committed in West Bank, and how they talk about it, and how China talks about its genocide, so that people and the listeners can see a slight difference as well. And there's also an element of laziness involved in terms of Pakistani people. It would be highlighted once I make this point. So when you look at how Israel has been carrying out its policies in Palestine over the past 40, 50 plus years, Israel doesn't try to hide what it has been doing much. Even when this particular round of hostilities happened after October 7th, initially it bombed some hospitals and it tried to deny it, but then it stopped denying. Videos were coming out on TikTok, on X, on Facebook, Instagram. People saw it, people shared it widely, and Israel stopped covering it up. Because Israel had the complete backing of the US, Germany, by and large, the EU as well. So Israel didn't care about trying to hide what it's been doing. Even though Israel's propagandists, they have tried to cover it up to the best of their abilities, right? But by and large, Muslims all over the world, and even in Pakistan, they see through it. Now let's compare it with what China has been doing over the past 10 plus years. We all know that the genocide in Xinjiang, in East Turkistan, China invests billions of dollars to cover it up. And China never admits what it's been doing in East Turkistan. China always tries to come up with some sort of explanation that, we're giving them vocational training, we are, these are re-education camps, some of them are extremist elements, some of them are separatists. Obviously, we know it's all garbage. These are just talking points because we know there are Uyghurs who have nothing to do with any of that sort of crime. It's just a lame excuse China comes up with to put Uyghurs in these concentration camps. We all know that there are Uyghur professors, Uyghur teachers, Uyghur singers and entrepreneurs. They've all put in these concentration camps for little to no reason. And sometimes China cooks up reasons after they put them in concentration camps, which is quite silly. But the point I'm trying to make is China tries really hard to cover it up by investing in propaganda, and then also by talking to the governments of all the Muslim countries and telling them to not talk about it, especially at the UN. Whenever there has to be a vote for East Turkestan, the Western countries, they vote freely. But the Muslim countries, all of them, they vote in favor of China because they don't want to make China angry, because they have to earn investments, China's support for them in terms of infrastructure projects, and because, of course, China is one of the veto holding members at the UN Security Council. So China's every country likes to at least have either China or Russia on their side so that diplomatically they can have a strong backing. So now getting to the question, the image of China, it's very sad, but despite the Uyghur genocide, which has been happening for over a decade now, most people in Pakistan, they're clueless. If you talk to an average person, the image of China is very clean. And the image of China, the most people, like the average people, they see that China is a dependable ally. China is a better ally than the US. China has always helped Pakistan during the time of Pakistan's need, whether it's a war with India, whether it's economic difficulties, whether it's loans, and all sorts of these things. So, but when you talk to these educated people in the universities, think tanks, intellectuals, they are aware of what China is doing. But the sad part is they don't want to admit it. Some, they do admit it, but they never talk about it openly. They talk about Palestine, they talk about other issues, but they don't talk about the Uyghur genocide. But the saddest part is, which I've always found very not only infuriating as a Pakistani, but also hard to understand that, okay, people who belong to sort of a socialist understanding, they have a sweet spot, they have a soft spot for China, right? So if they don't talk about what's happening in East Turkestan to Uyghurs, at least from their standpoint, it's understandable because they're socialists. They have strong affinity to communism or the Chinese socialism, whatever. But when you look at the Islamic parties in Pakistan, for example, like you have Jamaat-e-Islami, JI, you have another party called Jamiat Ulama Islam Fazl, JUIF. These are Islamic parties. And they talk about Muslim causes all over the world. But when it comes to the genocide in East Turkestan, they never talk about it. They also don't carry out protests or write press releases. In fact, the previous chief of this party called JI, his name was Sirajul Haq. He actually met the Chinese ambassador at that time. I forgot that ambassador's name, who was based in Pakistan. And he met him multiple times. And when I saw that press release afterwards, there was no mention of Uyghur genocide. And I talked about it on Facebook and social media to create a sort of an issue out of it. But they were like, again, the same thing, that we don't want to make China angry because China is our strong ally. So all of these political parties, they basically follow the narrative of the state of Pakistan. And the state of Pakistan feels that we can never abandon China and we should never criticize China at any point. So to answer your question briefly, the image, even after the genocide of Uyghur people and millions of people in concentration camps, the image of China is still very clear for most people in Pakistan, which is very unfortunate. And that is why I've been writing about this issue for over 8 years now. Ever since I came back from China, I started educating myself, learning from the Uyghur people from all over the world, and then telling others, not only my people in Pakistan, but other Muslims as well, who don't talk about this issue as much. Because I like to tell them that the entire world is talking about Palestine, and we should talk about Palestine. Of course, it's a very important issue. We should talk about Syria as well, because the Syrian people, they suffered a lot. We should talk about Yemen and other issues as well. But at the same time, why do we ignore this suffering of Uyghur people and their genocide? And especially when it comes to Pakistanis, because we, in Pakistan, we share a direct border with East Turkestan, so it becomes incumbent upon us to talk about their suffering. But we don't do that, which is quite unfortunate, and it's really sad. But to your listeners, my message would be that I, at least as an individual, will keep trying to educate as many people as I can to the best of my abilities, inshallah.
Thank you so much. And that is really a critical issue you raised, and it is essential to explore how these policies resonate with Pakistan's government and its people. And this has been an enlightening discussion, Usman. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise with us.
Rahmat.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. And if you enjoyed this episode or found it thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe and share it with others. See you next time. Take care.